making this video, I was perusing for some inspirations for the concept of a painting that I'm currently cooking up. And I happened to stumble across a still from this film that I really liked, and it really sparked my inspiration and motivation to paint. So I figured, since the sem is already ending, it'd be nice to just sit back and paint some movie scenes in this cool down time. Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, released internationally in 2019 as Portrait of a Lady on Fire, is a French film set in France 1770 that depicts the experience of love through the lenses of women. It follows the events of the life in retrospect of a painter, Marianne, as she was commissioned to paint a portrait of a young woman whom she will later meet as Eloise. Eloise's mother, her main client, briefed Marianne of the past troubles that they had with the painters in rendering her daughter's portrait, and the challenge that would come along upon painting Eloise. With the challenge came intimacy and electricity between the two women as they wade through a love uncharted and ineffable, and grappled with the bonds that the patriarchy has chained upon them. I first saw this movie late last year in 2020, and I immediately fell in love with the premise of the film. But more than that, I also fell in love with a lot of the other aspects of the film that I aim to share with you all later on. In this video, I used my Marie's Jelly Gouache 24 color set. It has some unique colors that are nice to play around with, and it is also very similar to the feel of the Himimiya Jelly Gouache. It isn't my first time to play around with this set, so I know how the paint will perform on the paper that I used. And I also utilized these cute purple Taklon brush set, and I mostly used the small and fine ones because of the surface area of the paper that I used. Speaking of the paper, I used my Paul Rubens sketchbook that is about 5 by 7 inches, I think. I really like this paper because it's comparable to the quality of the cold pressed Arches watercolor paper. It receives the water very well in my use of it with gouache, but I'm not entirely certain for watercolor, so I've yet to try it with other mediums. I also used a scrap of a leftover actual Arches watercolor paper from one of my past plates for my recreation of the shot of Eloise's dress caught on fire. I went ahead and did the sketch prior to my filming of the painting process because the sketch took a lot of time in getting how I wanted to set the painting from the reference photos. For the first reference, I painted a still of Marianne in her process of painting Eloise's portrait. In the second still, I chose Eloise in the green dress by the shore, and as I mentioned earlier, I also painted the scene where Eloise's dress was caught on fire. And with all of that specifics out of the way, let's get right on to painting while I walk you through the process and yap about all the things that I loved about the movie. Before I begin, I would like to put out a disclaimer that I am in no way a master at painting or in using gouache or in portraiture. I'm just here to share how I do my painting specifically and how I generally interpret the reference photo. There really isn't any rhyme or reason as to why I do the techniques that I did here in the way I've done. It's all based on my gut feeling of what I needed to define first in order for the picture to make sense to me. Generally, I try to remember the darkest dark parts and the lightest light parts and try not to fiddle with those much. The form of the subject is easily influenced by these parts, so I try to be as decisive as I can when I'm painting them. As for this one, I first established the color of the background before I started to paint the subject. I think some are intimidated in laying down the first stroke of paint on the canvas, and I suggest this method if you feel this way, because I feel that way a lot of times. And sometimes when you can't see the stark whiteness of the canvas, it feels less daunting and you'll feel more comfortable in laying down your paint. to keep your ears busy as I paint with my tiny hands, I'd also like to share my thoughts on the film. Right off the bat, the screenplay of this film was so good. You know those films that make you just always remember the lines? Yeah, this is one of those films. Though the vernacular of the film was in French and the lines that I remember were the English translation, and hence there are expected discrepancies in the actual meaning of the words in the screenplay, but was still so powerful and moving. This film actually got a 98% in Rotten Tomatoes, which is outstanding. I rarely find movies that reach this number because many critics and viewers give their reviews of films in this platform, and they are renowned at this field. And now that I'm thinking about it, it's not really much of a surprise for this film because it was that good, which is well deserved. I also did some research about the film and I read in an article about the film by Rachel Syme in The New Yorker in March 2020, and she mentioned that it is more than a manifesto of the female gaze. Words said by the film's director, Celine Sciamma, because the film ultimately captures the hardships of being a woman before the 20th century. My sister and I would often talk about the hypothetical lives that we would have should we live in such an era. And we both believe that we won't be able to survive it because besides being brown, Asian, and not bourgeois, yeah, we won't survive that. And so just imagining of what women actually went through such oppressive times, especially non-white, underprivileged, and marginalized women, makes us just wanna basically sell our souls to the devil like Adi LaRue. For the next still, I felt that I kind of wanted to paint a landscape at that time, so I chose this quite iconic scene from the film wherein Eloise stood by the shore of the beach in her green dress. For this one, I chose to paint Eloise first because I want to be certain of her position in the picture in full color. Also, I just wanted to paint it something green. My approach for this one is to lay down the darks first before I paint it over with the lightest parts. It's important to remember that I am doing this because gouache is an opaque medium, like acrylic and oil. But when you're using watercolor, you have to be more decisive and careful because it's not as forgiving as gouache or acrylic. Once you lay down the paint there at a certain part and it dries, it's kind of difficult to get rid of it. The paper can tear or it would still have some sort of hue that could result to the final output looking very overworked, which is not what you want. Going back to the film, the cinematography of the film was also chef's kiss. If you would take a critical look at most films, more often than not, the way the scenes are shot objectifies the body or the features of women, especially in featuring female to female coupling. But in this film, the reason why the director coined it as a manifesto of the female gaze without being too heavy here is because at no point did it ever portray the women as objects of desire, even at its most intimate and revealing moments. For me, I could feel the most tension between Marianne and Eloise when they simply look at each other, which means the acting was A+++ too. I could get into detail about this even more, but it wouldn't be an art-related video anymore, so I'll just keep it short and sweet. I loved the simplicity of the elements in the film, their costumes, the setting, and even the color grading. It's so consistent in all the visual elements that it successfully and convincingly established an aesthetic. I just really enjoyed the experience of watching this film. And this is also the reason why I enjoyed painting the stills from the film as well. It made me itch to get my brush and paints and create something. That's one of the most unique feelings a film could ever impart to me. For the last movie still that I will be painting, I chose to recreate the most iconic one with Eloise's dress caught on fire. This still was probably the most enjoyable for me to paint. As much as I suck at painting and sketching fabric, I love the process of painting it and watching it come to life. Although I suck at it, I love painting it. I also like how I added my own spin to this portrait, which you will see in the final result. For this one, I was all over the place with how I chose to structure the manner that I paint the subject. But as long as you're satisfied with your work, for me, as long as I was satisfied at the end, I don't think it matters much. So just go with the flow that you think would make sense to you because it is your artwork and you should be your best judge. A side note, I'd just like to share a tip that might help you when you're painting on your own time. Do a warm up art first. I don't know if you also experience this, but sometimes when you dive straight into the actual artwork that you're doing without a warm up, you experience more troubles than you might anticipate in the process. It's probably the same concept as warming up before you exercise, I think. This is just a theory, but it works most times for me, and it might work for you if you don't know this already. And it's also what I do before I proceed to making huge paintings and murals and when I create my plates. So it's a good exercise to practice. And for my final thoughts about the film, more than the love between Marianne and Eloise, I also appreciated their depiction of the camaraderie between the couple and Sophie, the housemaid, whom Marianne became fond of and whom the couple also helped through a very tough time in her life. If you've already watched the film, you'd know that there was little to no men who had considerable amount of airtime. And yet the impetus of the events revolving around the women protagonists were men. They were merely mentioned, and yet they hold such a power over the lives of the female characters in the film, which is a mirror as to how the patriarchy it really doesn't have any tangible shape, but it holds the lives of women and continues to do so in the present. I just thought that that was so genius and well thought and so well deserved of the praise that it's gotten. I'm also a stickler for details, so I really loved the little things and the quiet moments throughout the film, which I think if you watch the film, you would get what I mean. But if you are kind of like this as well and you haven't watched the film, then I highly suggest that you watch it and see for yourself. These are the finished pieces for painting movie stills from Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I hope you enjoy watching this video and picked something up along the way. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you tune in again to the next one.